Okay, good morning, everyone. All right, welcome back to day two. I hope you enjoyed and got as much out of day one as I did yesterday. Some fascinating conversations as we discussed. It was the perspective of those practitioners we learned a great deal from General Groen through the service perspectives, and certainly wrapping up the day as George promised. It would be very fascinating and maybe somewhat scary, and they delivered on that in that final panel. Today we're going to shift some gears and go to the perspectives, comparative perspectives, some philosophical perspectives, and so on. But I realized yesterday at lunch, and it was kind of reinforced for me at the reception in the evening, that we do have a few, maybe more than a few, first-time participants in the McCain Conference, and perhaps it would be helpful if I gave just a little bit of context about the Stockdale Center. And even for those who had been away from the McCain Conference for a few years or away from the Academy and the Stockdale Center, it might be helpful to describe how we got to where we are right now and the nature of the Stockdale Center. So the origins of the center trace back to 1998, when the center was stood up initially as the Center for the Study of Professional Military Ethics. And in that process, it was determined that, in fact, it was written into the charter, that it would serve as a beacon for the nation. So since that point forward, 1998 until now, we've tried to strike a balance in accordance with that initial charter, that vision statement, to serve as a beacon for the nation, as in serving the greater needs of the Navy, the Marine Corps, other government agencies, even transnational organizations such as NATO. We've had a long, I think, productive relationship with NATO and other organizations over the span of that time. But as the center evolved, certainly in 2006, it was renamed the Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. Along with the name change came a number of changes or a number of additions to that initial almost sole focus on ethics research. And the team has grown correspondingly, adding organizational behavior as a discipline, adding to the mix IO psychologists and a variety of other things that are more normally associated perhaps with the leadership part of all of this. And over that span of time, we've tried to kind of, again, strike a balance, not just in terms of the up and out in support of other government agencies by adding a distinguished chair from Department of Homeland Security. We're about to add another chair from the FBI and so on, but also looking at the down and in part and how best the center could support the teaching of leadership and ethics. And you got a small taste of that addition yesterday from Mr. Michael Sears, who is the director of our innovation lab, initially sponsored by the Boeing Company in its early years. So when you look at that full mix, there's a lot of things going on in Stockdale. We hope you have the opportunity to not only look into some of the material that is found through those QR codes that Michael talked about yesterday, but engage with other members of the Stockdale Center team that do just such a wide variety. I'm so honored to be a part of that team because of this really wide variety of things that are done in Stockdale pretty much day in, day out. But as we shift gears into day two of this conference, in many ways, we are returning to that initial core mission. If you look at today's lineup of things, again, comparative philosophies, comparative perspectives, we're going to have moral psychology. That's kind of the traditional bread and butter of the Stockdale Center, or as it was called in its early form, the Center for the Study of Professional Military Ethics. And it's with very good reason that we start off this morning, actually, since we're looking at this kind of crown jewel issue of the Stockdale Center and why the McCain Conference was stood up in the first place. No better place to start than with the intellectual traditions that inform what we do. And no two better people for that. So I'm going to introduce the panelists. That's the hurricane exercise. We don't have to leave, right? That's. Those words are out. Yeah. I feel like I should be doing push-ups right now.
surrounding areas. Seek shelter immediately.
Well, we're well sheltered here, so I'll give that a second.
A tornado warning has been issued for the installation and surrounding areas. Seek shelter immediately.
If that's not a reminder we're on a government installation, nothing ever would be, right? All right, very good. I think we may have a couple more of those, Karin, is that right, throughout the day, or is that the one and only? Do you know?
So it's any time, I think, between 9 and 9:30.
Okay, all right, and it'll be over after that point. All right, very good. So with that, I'm gonna get right to these introductions here, so we can jump off, and we'll play the exercise by ear as it kind of goes along. First of all, Dr. Jovana Davidovic is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Iowa, where she holds a complementary appointment at the law school and the Center for Human Rights. She's also been a resident Stockdale Fellow with us, a research fellow with us this past year. We're honored to have her. Her research focuses on military ethics and philosophy of international law, including the ethics of AI, algorithmic auditing, and the changing character of war. She's also worked extensively as an ethics consultant for international banks, Big Four professional service firms, and humanitarian organizations, most recently serving as the Chief Ethics Officer for Babel AI, an algorithmic bias auditing and ethics consultancy. And joining Jovana today is Dr. Dave Barnes. He is a recently retired Brigadier General from the Army after 32 years of distinguished service, most recently serving as professor at West Point's Department of English and Philosophy and as Chief AI Ethics Officer at the U.S. Army's Artificial Intelligence Integration Center. He is a DARPA Senior AI Ethics Advisor, a Senior Advisor for the JAIC Responsible AI Subcommittee, a non-resident fellow at the Stockholm Center for Ethics of War and Peace, and the author of Ethics of Military Privatization. He graduated from the United States Military Academy and earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Colorado Boulder. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. And thanks to the Stockdale Center for inviting me to come and speak with you all today. And appreciate you all coming in this morning to listen to this old tanker talk a little bit about AI and ethics. And even though I'm retired, I'm still going to give the disclaimer, right? What I have to talk about today are my personal reflections, remarks, and don't necessarily affect those of the Army, the Department of Defense. Ethics ain't a dirty word. Ethics ain't a dirty word. This is a phrase that I used when Mr. Deasy, then the DISO, and then head of the JAIC, Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, came to visit the Army AI Task Force, the early conception of the Integration Center in Pittsburgh. And part of it was just to get their attention, to take a pause for a minute, right? To dispel some of the myths that are out there about artificial intelligence and ethics. One of them is this: the algorithms, they're values neutral. Well, in a sense they are, right? I mean, mathematics are values neutral, right? Or can we talk about them being morally good, morally bad? Probably not. But the other issue, the other myth is that I've tried to counter is this notion that when we're really talking about AI ethics, we're talking about AI safety, or we're talking about AI reliability, or as many of you heard, we're talking about trustworthy AI. And the reason those are myths is each of those are necessary, but not sufficient to truly have ethical AI in terms of how we design, build it, deploy it, and use it out in the field and then retire it later on. So at risk of being somewhat immodest, I want to be the transition point and segue from our discussion yesterday, right? Excellent discussions from the different services about where we're at right now, where we're headed in terms of the responsible AI in the Department of Defense, because like Alexander Hamilton, I got to be in the room where it happened, purely by accident. All right, so part of this started in working with one of the speakers you'll hear from this afternoon, Dr. Phil Root, as part of his DARPA's URSA program. And the idea, which now, even just several years later, seems common sense, is we started with the premise that perhaps we should take a look at legal, moral, and ethical problems, right, that might affect the design and development of a particular DARPA project, right, for the performers right from the get-go. So we assembled a rather extensive committee of esteemed subject matter experts. I was just lucky to be able to take notes. And, you know, Mitt's here, right? I mean, there's several of us that got to participate in this and continue to do so. But you have to understand, like, this is really game-changing, right? As Mitt mentioned yesterday, we look at weapon systems and we do a legal review prior to it being fielded. But with the billions of dollars that are being invested in software and artificial intelligence, even from a purely practical standpoint, you can't wait until the end to do a review to ensure that it's been designed and developed, right, built ethically, and that in fact it'll be deployed ethically and legally. So this was, in a sense, a beginning of a shift. And DARPA, as Phil will talk about it, is beginning to look at this in other capacities. The second aspect was I was very fortunate to be able to help and ghostwrite the supporting documents for the DIB principles, right? And so, and as mentioned yesterday, and as we'll talk about this morning, now there are tens of sets, perhaps hundreds of sets of principles that are out there. Very important. They are guidelines, right? Was accepted by the former Secretary of Defense, reaffirmed by the current administration, and it forms the path forward. But really, that's where the hard work needs to begin. How do we take those principles and put them into practice? And so for people like me and many of the folks in this room who are both an academic as well as a practitioner, who are tied to the department in some sort of official capacity, right, we end up having multiple roles. We have to ensure that the work we're doing is theoretically sound. We have to get buy-in by the senior administration so that, you know, that becomes the new glide path for where the enterprise is heading. And we have to ensure that we actually take that theory and put that into practice throughout the force. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about where we went, right, how we got to this place and where we're going. Focus more on where we're going. I'm going to talk about three things, right? First is what AI isn't. The second bit is social technical problem set of AI and that we're the limiting factor. And the third is thinking about how to build a DoD intelligent enterprise. AI systems are stupid. As brilliant as they are at solving certain narrow problems, they are stupid. Now, it's my belief that we're not on a path right now to AGI, to general intelligence. We might get there, but the current focus isn't there, and as General Groen said, that's not the current focus of the DoD. And we can talk about that in Q&A if you want to. But having said that, there's still much work that needs to be done, right? These systems are brittle, right? There's problems of overfit, right? There's problems with the saturation, with blindness. When we think about AI, and Joe Chapa mentioned the DoD's definition yesterday, right? About doing those tasks that normally a human can perform, we have to think of the AI systems that we have now, right? Are deductive and inductive and hybrid approaches, essentially tools, right, to solving narrow data-centric problems. Now, we can begin to layer them, but we are really in these initial steps. And there's still a lot of work to be done, right? There's still current issues about the opaqueness of the black boxes, right? How do we do T&E for a learning system that, by its definition, is different tomorrow than it was today, unless it's fixed in time before it's deployed? Mentioned layered AI, right? So when we talk about these systems deployed, in particular perhaps with an autonomous system that is operating, you know, on the battlefield, there are going to be multiple layers of these narrow AI working together. So we have to think of them not only independently, but as a system of systems, and how is it going to interact with other AI that it encounters? And then, as was discussed briefly yesterday, how do we think about adversarial AI? And the bottom line with these kind of things, they may not seem like ethics on the surface, but we have to remember that if our decisions, wherever we live in that AI lifecycle, the design team, development, deploy, use, retire, the acquisition decision, the commander that signs off that we're going to do it, whoever's funding the money, if our decision affects people, at a minimum, it's a values-laden and an ethical decision, right? It's a part of all that business. All right, so why are we the LIMFAC? Now, I'm probably dating myself with LIMFAC, right? You know, the old acronym for limited factor, right? It's because we're the ones, not necessarily the technology. As problematic as I may have mentioned, and we saw yesterday, we are the ones that are making the decisions. We're the ones that need to be making the decisions. We are the ones that need to be involved. Because it's not general intelligence, it is my belief that discussions right now about AI having agency, having volition, they're just non-starters. What we need to be focused on is if AI is an artifact as it's defined in law right now, then how do we account for, say, a principle like fairness, which we have equity. By the way, the reason why we have equity, not fairness, is when we were writing it, people thought, well, we don't treat our enemy fairly, right? We don't fight fairly. I was like, okay, we'll do it equitably. But words do matter. But what does that mean? Right? Are we talking about fair distribution, or are we talking about the process, the procedure of getting fairness? Who gets to decide? Because what we're doing is we're translating, right, our human values, our societal's values, our desires into mathematics so that the system can understand it. And we have to be able to do it even if we're using a deep learning system so that we can then check if it's getting the results that we expected. But we're the ones who decide that. We're the ones who are going to decide whether we're going to release lethal autonomy on the battlefield. Responsibility gap is easy for the military because guess what? We have command responsibility. But again, the onus is back on the person. So what do we need for that, right? We need diverse teams working throughout the life cycle for any of these projects, right? It needs to be a life cycle. We can't just look at it in isolation. You can't just look at it from your particular foxhole and say, I'm at the point of employment, I don't care what happened before me, and I don't care what happened after, right? It has to be throughout the process, and you have to look at it often, right? I mentioned we have to have the policy decisions about what these principles, in effect, may mean for us, as an example, right? What sort of bias? Do we want the system to reflect the data the way the world is, or what we want the world to be? That's our decision, not the machine's decision. And we need regulation, but we need to do it without ensuring that we don't stifle innovation. So why is that important? We have to think about DoD and AI as more as the DoD's intelligence organization, which is a phrase I'm borrowing from friend Jeff McMillan, who's at Morgan Stanley. He's the CDO there. Because AI is going to be ubiquitous. It's going to affect all different aspects of us. We're focused primarily on things on the battlefield, right? But it's going to have all these back applications, and that's going to be an important aspect of everything that we do. So how do we create a department that is transformed to take the best advantages, right, mitigates the risks to accomplish our nation's need? One of the first steps is education. To paraphrase Carl Sagan, there's a lot of BS and baloney out there. Another thing that I've heard, and Jeff has mentioned it too, is the quarter and quarter rule. One quarter, one quarter. So all the hype you hear, right, when someone comes and pitches a new AI system to you, roughly 1/4 of them are going to be able to work. Then from that small set, only approximately 1/4 of those will be able to be scalable. and be able to put into use. So beware of that. And what it starts is AI education. Yes, we need a pipeline for data scientists, right? We need people educated on responsible AI, and the ethics associated with that, right? We need our lawyers to understand, the law specific to this kind of technology. But what we also need is AI education for every person. For me and my tribe, that's for every soldier. For your tribe, that's for every, sailor, every Marine, airman, guardian. What does the youngest private to the secretary need to know about the benefits, the limitations, and the risks of artificial intelligence from her foxhole? If we don't have that, as an institution, as an enterprise, we're not going to really be able to take full advantage of it. We're not going to be able to move forward. We have to think of this as a whole of enterprise process. We have something like that, right? We have .mil PFP, right? We have an ability to do it. We can't treat these things in isolation. These are going to be tools as part of our functions. And what that means is there's going to be two major lines of effort. One is, how do we take our current system, right? All our systems that we have now. And there's a lot of legacy equipment that we have and ways that we do business. How can we improve upon them? How can we begin to collect the data? How can we is it possible to take the data we already have, ensure that it's properly curated, and be able to use it to advance the algorithms and the process forward? But at the same time, we can't take our eye off the ball in the future. This is an opportunity to reimagine, whether it's from the Army's perspective, Navy's perspective, or how we fight as a joint force, how we do business to leverage, albeit what I said earlier, stupid technology, to our best advantage. And everything should be on the table. Last bit about that is, I think the best way to think about it, and I wish I had thought of this several years ago when I was back in Pittsburgh, first starting out in this position, is risk management. We teach risk management here, right? Everyone talks about, I'll go back to everyone talks about risk management, right? We use comprehensive risk management. There's the joint policy for it. Each of the services have it. We think about risk of mission, risk of force. I think we ought to think about risk of collateral damage, right? Risk to civilians. Why don't we expand the scope a little bit? What are the risks, in particular, to using a certain AI-enabled system legally, morally, ethically? We already do this. In a couple administrations ago, the release authority for offensive cyber was with the commander-in-chief. Part of the reason was the uncertainty about, in a sense, that technology, that strike getting out of the bag, and the consequences were unknown. Or so dire that, much like a nuclear weapon, the release authority ought to be held there. Right? There was a risk calculus to this. It could be the case, and I'm not advocating for it, but it could be the case that fully autonomous lethal weapons require a high level of release authority, if we're going to have them at all. Well, let's do the work. Let's leverage the processes, right, that we have, the laws that we have, right, as best that we can, knowing that we're going to have to make the changes to them for the particular problem set that AI brings, and identify who has the sign-off authority. So, Chief AI Ethics Officer, you might be asking. I'm the first one in the DoD. I made it up. Nobody had it. And part of the reason that we created this position is we could see, and our colleagues out in the industry, wrestling with some of the same problems that we are. And it's like, how do we better communication? How do we break down the barriers so that we can learn about shared struggles and then share the best practices? And how do we get the attention of the leadership? But yet you look around today, do a quick Google of AI ethics officer, responsible AI ethics officer, and there are many. The Air Force has one. right? The services are now going through this process. It's kind of interesting. All right, so last bit is why responsible AI? Why not trustworthy AI? Why not something else? And I know Jovana's going to talk about trust in a bit. Well, part of it is some people were in the camp that we ought to be focused on the use of the artificial intelligence. So it should be responsible use of artificial intelligence. And that seemed for many to incorporate more than just the ethics piece. Why? Because as the military, we oftentimes, sometimes have been guilty about it as a commander, ethical question, great chaplain, what's the story? Again, ethics ain't a dirty word. It involves all of our craft. So last bit and takeaways. One, don't believe the hype, or at least don't believe all of it. Use your critical reasoning skills and really focus on your younger folks because it's going to fall upon you to really implement this. AIs are tools, but they're not always the best tool. Ask yourself, when we're rushing to do it, does this need a data-centric solution? Do we need to leverage an algorithm? Is that the best thing to do in this case, right? Stop asking, can we do it? Maybe ask, should we do it? We are the LIMFAC. We are the limiting factors. Educate, educate, educate. We can all do better at that, myself included. And last bit is we're all responsible. Wherever we serve within the enterprise or in support of it, have a role. And there you go. And just like that, it's time to leave the stage. So thank you all for listening to me today. I appreciate it. Look forward to questions.
So I just want to start off by thanking you all for attending, thanking the Stockdale Center for bringing us all together. I have, as Joe has mentioned, been here for about a year with 3 other wonderful fellows working on AI ethics, and I've loved every second of it. Thanks to people like Joe, Karen, who I think just stepped out, Mr. Sears, Captain Frankie, and Ed, of course. And I was very grateful to Ed until he called me up and said, hey, can you give a 20-minute history of all of ethics of AI? So this is going to be sort of a fast and dirty version of that. I'm going to try to give a bit of an overview of where AI ethics as a field is now, and then if I have the time, look at where I think we should be going next. Next. Is that right? There we go. So AI ethics started, and especially AI ethics for military purposes, started when we realized there is a great potential in AI. So around the same time AI started, following behind, people started thinking about AI ethics. And AI really has an amazing capacity to make warfighting better and ethically better, right? You can make warfighters faster, we can be more accurate, therefore we can have less collateral harm, we can have less harm to soldiers, less PTSD, less moral injury. But all of these awesome things about AI are also the sorts of things, or the things that underpin the features that make AI capable of bringing these benefits to warfighting, these ethical benefits to warfighting, are also the features that make AI really worrisome. So these are things like the ability to process massive amounts of data you and I can't, the ability to see patterns you and I can't, the ability to replace or augment our decision-making, right? So the same things that make it powerful are the things that make it dangerous. And so the field of AI ethics emerged out of that, and maybe I should just say next, there we go. What most of the literature has focused on is what I call the Big Ten. I mean, there's lots of other topics that literature is focused on, including AGI, sometimes for better or worse, but these are the Big Ten topics that I think are in almost every paper on AI ethics, especially for AI-enabled weapon systems. So people ask the question of, what exactly are autonomous weapon systems? That's one obvious question. What are we theorizing about? And this, you might think, would be an obvious question, but it's not. So that conceptual question is one of the questions that a lot of people tackle. Autonomy, right? Autonomy is a big one. Everybody and their mother is asking, what is autonomy? How do we define it? Why is it ethically problematic? And when is it ethically problematic? Related to that, we have topics of human in the loop, meaningful human control, or appropriate human judgment, as well as explainability. All of those are the sorts of topics that I'm sure you have heard yesterday, you're going to hear about today. And they permeate the literature on AI ethics, especially for AI-enabled weapon systems. Related to that, we have questions like trust. Now, questions like trust can be operational questions, right? How do we get our warfighters to trust AI? There are also ethical questions. When should a warfighter trust AI as a matter of morality, right? When is AI trustworthy? Related to that, we've had questions about responsibility and accountability, law of armed conflict, and more recently, ethicists have started worrying about what we would think of as operational considerations like testing, evaluation, verification, and validation, and rightly so. So not all of these, you might think to yourself, not all of these are ethical questions. Some of these look like, the arms race, security dilemma. That looks like a strategic question. Trust, TEV, that looks like operational questions. Obviously, the last one, law of armed conflict, looks like a legal question. But all of these both inform ethics and are informed by ethics and are widely discussed in the literature. So what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit, obviously I can't talk about all of these, so what I want to do is spend a little bit of time on sort of the first 5, autonomy and meaningful human control, and a little bit of time on the bottom half, so trust and responsibility. And just say a little bit about where the field is, some of the key interesting features about the field, and then also where we're going from here. So one of the first decisions that an ethicist has to make when they're working in this field is what's going to be their lens. The obvious one is autonomy. A lot of people start from what is autonomy, and I'm going to talk about, say the ethicist, about the thing that fits into the bucket of autonomous weapon systems, right? But you don't have to make that choice. You can, as several slides, including Joe's yesterday, had, you can maybe focus on machine learning, right? Machine learning, it brings different sorts of morally salient issues to the table than autonomy, right? Some morally salient issues emerge out of lack of autonomy or autonomy. Others emerge out of machine learning. And yet others take the choice of multi-sufficient condition approach. So DIB, I would say, takes the approach of saying, well, what we're really going to be talking about are things that resemble human intelligence or use machine learning to resemble human intelligence or do something altogether third. So one of the first things people have to decide, scholars decide, is what is the lens they're going to use to circumscribe the stuff they're talking about. And a popular answer in the field is autonomy, for obvious reasons, right? Autonomy brings forth some of the key ethical issues. One of the key variables that affects whether or not something is autonomous, of course, is where's the human? So I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but that's one of the key questions, right? Is there a human in the loop? Where is there a human on the loop? Do we have meaningful human control? Do we have appropriate human judgment? And so, as we saw yesterday, a lot of scholars look at different levels of meaningful human control. So we've moved from discussions of human in the loop, human on the loop, to discussions of so-called meaningful human control. And then, DOD, for example, said, meaningful human control, we don't really like the term. We're not sure what it means. It maybe asks too much of us. Let's focus on appropriate human judgment. That's broader. The reason I have this arrow to the left here and the sort of circles over there is human on the loop and human in the loop debates are about the OODA loop. It's a very particular set of debates. The meaningful human control and the appropriate human judgment could be debates about maybe we have human control in TEV, in testing and evaluation. Maybe we have human control in development. Maybe that's good enough, right? Maybe we'll just have somebody analyze the outcomes of what happens. Maybe that's good enough as well. The most sort of broad approach is what I'm calling here the systems life cycle approach, which is what the UK delegation to the CCW calls it, which is the idea that we should have human touch in every step of the way. So in R&D, T&E, command and control, use, and analysis. Every step of the way, as long as we have some human touch, that's really what we should be after. So there's a lot of really interesting debates going on about meaningful human control or just human touch and how it affects autonomy. What I think is missing is Let me go to that slide. What I think is missing is a careful analysis of what exactly are we after. And I probably shouldn't even have the word meaningful there. I should probably just have purpose of human touch. So everybody's calling for this, and people are having these debates. And it's not always clear why they want meaningful human control or why they want human control. What is it for? What is the purpose of it? The obvious one is safety and accuracy, right? One of the obvious reasons you want to have a human in the loop or you want to have meaningful human control is because and when you think that the machine is going to perform better when there's a human there, right? But there's plenty of times when it won't, right? And so you might ask yourself, okay, so if a machine is not going to perform better when there's a human in the loop, then could we still want to have meaningful human control? And the answer is yes. Why? Well, it could be for moral and legal responsibility assignments. Who do I hold responsible, right? It could be for morality and dignity. Some people think it's just undignified to be killed that it violates human dignity to be killed by a machine, right? It could be for purposes of democratic engagement, right? So we're going to have different purposes, and then the reason we should care about that is because they're going to drive our institutional design. And by institutional design, I simply mean where do we put the human, and how do we make sure that they're trained appropriately, and all the other institutional structures that go around that. We need to know what it's for. Sometimes meaningful human control is for more than one of these things. And that's going to drive different institutional design. So I think we have, Dave said, rightly so, there are dozens and hundreds of principles and lists of ethical principles out there. I think the era of that is done. We need to now move on and start carefully thinking about what does this look like, exactly as Dave said. What does this look like in practice? And for meaningful human control, that conversation should start with what is the purpose of it? And then we can have a conversation about where do we put this human, how do we train them, and so on. Relatedly, you can't do explainability analysis until you answer what's the purpose of meaningful human control, right? Because the sorts of explanations I should be giving are the explanations that fit meaningful human control, right? So again, everybody out there is saying, let's have explainability. Not having explainability is a serious issue. But what explainability should look like depends on who it's for. So maybe for an operator or a commander who needs to use the machine or AI, it looks very different. They don't necessarily need a robust understanding, like you and I don't need a robust understanding of GPS. Somebody working in TEV, in testing and evaluation, better be able to understand why the machine is doing what it's doing to be able to assess whether it's fit for purpose, right? So the types of explanations we need depend on who they're for. So similarly to my point about meaningful human control, I think it's time to sort of move away from generic claims of let's talk about human control, let's talk about explainability, and start thinking carefully about what that looks like for specific parts of the institutional design. And then test it and see what works. So that's all I'm going to say about meaningful human control and autonomy. So I just want to focus, as I said, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the second half, and that's trust and responsibility. I just want to say a few things about trust and responsibility. So starting off again, what are sort of the common themes in the literature? The common themes in the literature include discussions of normative versus practical trust. So the distinction between what makes something trustworthy, i.e. you and I should justifiably trust it, versus how do we get folks to trust it? Those are different questions and different fields and sciences engage in them. There's also a really meaningful set of debates about predictability-based trust and value-based trust. So predictability-based trust is trust you gain from using something, right? Or from careful TEV, right? You know it's going to work, it's predictable. Value-based trust comes from just the way that we embed value into, in this case, AI. So have we made sure that AI is, let's say, going to abide by the principle of discrimination, right? If I know that the developers and the testers have done so, they've made sure that the AI is going to be compatible with, let's say, the principle of discrimination, I have value-based reasons to trust it, whether or not I've used it before, and I can sort of predict the outcomes. There's a range of issues with trust that are well discussed, and I'm not going to go into great detail on these. Trust is important because it's related to all those other things on the Big Ten, right? So TEV, testing, evaluation, verification, and validation drives trust. Trust, in turn, justified trust, in turn, drives responsibility, right? So if you hadn't had reasons to trust a particular AI, then you're probably more morally responsible when it goes wrong than if you have had reason, calibrated trust in the machine, and then you used it. So, and similarly, responsibility and accountability obviously drive international law and are driven by international law. All of this, more importantly, is related to training. Training needs to be driven by TEV. That's what's supposed to happen next to 5. Training is supposed to be driven by TEV. So when we do careful testing, evaluation, verification, validation, we learn lessons about how to train. And in turn, training is going to make sure that we have trust. Training is going to make sure that we have responsibility and accountability. So all 5 of these are sort of tightly connected. And a lot of the literature acknowledges that, and a lot of the literature discusses them in that way. What's missing, and I think a lot of the conversations about trust and responsibility, is very much the same type of, conceptually same type of materials that are missing in meaningful human control and explainability. So, and that is careful parsing out of how are we building trust, who are we building trust for? Is it for the operator? Is it for the commander? Is it for the society? Right? So the sorts of ways in which we build AI and how we deploy it, if it's meant to be trustworthy, we have to ask ourselves, whom are we trying to make it trustworthy for? What it's going to look like for society to trust it, and what it's going to look like for an operator to trust it, and what it's going to look like for the potential adversaries to trust it, are going to be different things. So we need to, again, start thinking more narrowly about how do we build trust, not just for our operators, but for all the other potential stakeholders in this important debate. Responsibility and accountability, same point I've been making, which is we need to move away from worrying about responsibility gaps and ask ourselves, what type of responsibility are we after? Is it moral or is it legal? If it's moral, what type of moral responsibility? Are we interested in knowing who's blameworthy, or are we interested in knowing who can we hold liable to punitive harm or to defensive harm? Those are different types of moral responsibility and are going to drive different institutional design. The point that I keep on sort of repeating through all of these is it's time to sort of move on to more narrow questions. The field is no longer nascent, right? So we need to move on to more specific questions and start drilling into how do we take these amazing big principles and move forward to institutional design that captures them successfully. So just a few, we're sort of going to run out of time, just a few sort of main lessons that I think are important to take away. I think we need to start building ethics for the future AI now, so we're not falling behind like we did in the beginning. I think we need to start thinking carefully about institutional design that matches the DIB principles, that matches the many, many frameworks that are out there, and then test it, engage in some sort of reflective equilibrium. I don't dare mention Marxist dialectic between theory and practice in this venue, but the idea of let's test our principles in institutional design and reinform our principles. That's where I think the state of AI ethics is today. We need to not, in my view, be as worried about the Chinese and the arms race. We need to be making sure that our technology is fit for purpose. And the reason I say this is I think we're much more likely to lose the arms race if we're actually building fast. We're going to win the arms race if we build AI that's better, and that means fit for purpose, that means precise, that means trustworthy, right? And so these are not just sort of ethics after you do all the other stuff questions. Ethics just is making sure AI works well, operationally, effectively, including minimizing collateral damage. Meaningful human control, one of the main takeaways, meaningful human control is not the solution to everything at all. In fact, what we need to do now is, I think, once we add the meaningful human control or we add some sort of human in the loop, then we need to task what this socio-technical system, what types of ethical risks it poses. Because wherever we put the human, no matter how good our design is, there will still be ethical risks coming out of that system as a whole. That's where we should be going next, I think. And finally, the sort of main point I've been trying to make is we need to be precise and specific about calls for human control, calls for explainability, calls for trustworthiness, and calls for responsibility. And that's it. Thank you. questions. I think we're going to take George?
Raise this, but the responsibility gap that you talked about. Oh, sorry. The responsibility gap you talked about. I'm suspicious of that too, in a sense, and I wonder if you would agree with this characterization. It's an unfortunate one, and it resides with those of us who do the ethics of technology. The engineers and folks who do the design in the building and the users and so forth, and like, ethics, sorry David, is a dirty word because what it stands for is, ignorant, naysaying, scientifically illiterate Luddites who just want to get in the way of doing things and have all these anxieties, none of which actually go to ground in anything meaningful. Those are techno-pessimists, I guess. And I'm wondering if the responsibility gap is a product of somebody looking for some thread to pull or nit to pick with the chain of custody and accountability in the development of AI, and noticing that maybe it terminates in one definition here and it doesn't pick up until a little bit further downrange, and that gray area in between, which is frankly where accidents happen. And I think yesterday that's how several of our AI experts described it. Sometimes things just go wrong. And it doesn't mean you can't companies are held responsible, designers are held, even if they didn't do anything wrong, even if it was just a random event. Somebody's got to pay the bill, somebody's got to make restitution to the victims, or maybe they'll even lose contracts and so forth. But there's no accountability gap there. That's just a way of characterizing something on the part of someone who is afraid the development is going too fast or is going forward at all.
So I'll just a quick, and then I don't know if Dave has something to say about this, but I think one of the my main point here is that I think what responsibility gap filling will look like for different weapon systems and for different purposes, like moral responsibility versus legal, is just different for different weapon systems. And that might be an unsatisfying answer, but what I'm suggesting is that's where we are as a field. I think we now need to start not thinking, is there a responsibility gap in autonomous weapon systems, but go a little bit more narrowly. What does it look like for targeting decisions? What does it look like for coordinated drone swarms? What does it look like for Aegis? What does it look like for different systems? And I think we're going to come up with probably the fact that they're going to be different, but ultimately we can probably fill in the responsibility gap anywhere. And if we can't, we can maybe stipulate for legal purposes. So there might be, my point is, I don't think there's a responsibility gap across autonomous weapon systems. I think we just need to start thinking carefully about how that gets filled in for different types of weapon systems.
And I think that if there is a responsibility gap, it's not unique to AI, right? So, so simply when we think about the ethical problem space with artificial intelligence-enabled systems, right, you can bucket into when it works and when it doesn't work. And so when we have these technical failures, or it works in a way that it was unanticipated, right? If it's a learning inductive system, it's down the long trail of unintended consequences. In a sense, those are still technically, they're contingent, right? And as part of those arguments. I think what's more fundamental are the harder problems about what if it works exactly like we intended, right? That brings in concerns about honor, the spirit of the warrior was brought up yesterday. I mentioned, for command responsibility, at least from that standpoint, although I think it's improper to compare an AI system as an artifact with a human or a squad, as a commander, I'm not going to employ a squad that I'm not confident, I have trusted it that's ready to go, right? In a sense, I know that it's going to accept some risk, but why that risk decision is the commanders and the commanders alone. And I also think that we had in the past failures of other equipment. We may not immediately identify it, but there's been investigations, and they've held companies, potentially individual people within those manufacturers, accountable in a legal sense, and that would just be a longer process. So I agree. I think that it's really a non-starter in terms of a strong argument in this arena.
Tim Challams. I'm a consultant with Cyber Command, and I find it important to at least have an informal interface with the coders, programmers, and information folks. You know, Dave, you said that what we do should be theory-based, theoretically sound, I think that was the term you said. And what I find is that the word or phrase most used is data-driven, which means that the theory is presumed in the people who are handling that data. Jovana, I was encouraged to hear you say theory-based, which is a bit better because that implies that the people are conscious that there are multiple theories engaged and that there usually is a conscious decision on the theory that's employed. So my question to both of you is, would there be any value in each of the services or maybe altogether or in certain research institutions to think of the services as a whole, to have the folks who are looking at ethical theory and principles and legal principles and so forth to more formally interface with coders, programmers, information handlers to create and look for patterns of non-combatants, human shields, and so forth. And in that way, kind of bridge this gap between artificial intelligence, which is all about data, and Dave, what you called general intelligence, which is the kind of thinking at a level of abstraction much higher than that to help influence that process.
So absolutely. So in my non-military AI analysis work, I do risk assessments, ethical risk assessments for the industry, and that's what we do. We talk to developers and coders. We also talk to stakeholders and people it's being used on, but we talk to all people in the sort of chain of development and use to assess the types of risks that could emerge. So absolutely, I think that's, without that, we can't design responsibly, and we certainly can't make sure that it's fit for purpose, including that it's, for example, minimizes collateral damage.
You know, for everyone here, in particular the philosophers, we appreciate that so much of what is presumed are really still open questions, right? And so, you know, when I say that we're the impact, I'm looking at those of us who study theory, you know, who have to help advise and nudge, you know, the institution, the enterprise, in a sense, settling on something, recognizing this assumption, be ready to change it. But we see the same thing in industry, right? How many people, Tim, have you run into, you know, coders are utilitarian, whether they know it or not, right? They just presume that that's the case. And you know, you talk to people who work in ML and deep learning, right? They assume that we have an account of how the brain works, and therefore the mind, and therefore conscious, and therefore as long as we have deep enough levels, and as long as we can, you know, increase computing power, and Lord knows we get just even more data, eventually we'll have that, right? What's missing from those conversations, and at some point, I get it, you have to settle on what the theory is, make your assumption, note it, and move forward, is some of those debates, right? In a sense, they've been closed off too often. And, you know, now that I'm retired, I can say this, look, I see, unfortunately, more reluctance within government to have deep conversations about AI ethics because I think, quite frankly, people think it's somebody else's responsibility. And what's happening is this interesting transformation, not just with what happened with Maven and the rebellion at Google with that, is private industry is like, oh, this isn't just ESG, this is really important about our return on investment and bottom line, we better get serious about it. And so it's time for the department to stop playing lip service, and none of us have here, but really, in a sense, you know, settle on some of these hard questions so that we can move forward.
Maybe we should go to a minute?
Yeah, let's get it. And we'll come back, sorry.
Good morning, ma'am and sir. Mitchum, third class Zimmer. My question is partially related to the previous one. You both talked about non-isolated life cycles of artificial intelligence, and could you possibly speak to any unintended consequences or compounding bias, as the presence of different human touches throughout the implementation and development of AI ultimately introduce different biases into that system?
So I think here's sort of a broad-based one, and then maybe we can get into some specifics. So there's a great article in Wired magazine a year ago that was talking about coders, right? Those who write the code and those who work on it. For them, if you have a conversation, and I'm sure Dr. Challenge has, it's their focus, the good that they are trying to achieve is optimizing the code. That's the only good. But is that the only good? And what she may fail to realize is that unconsciously, she's bringing her worldview into every decision she makes in terms of writing or trimming the code that's there. And that has downstream effects. Again, potentially unintended. The other aspect of it is not just there as the individual, it's this notion with learning systems we talked about is just thinking of it as an inductive system, right? I mean, it runs into potentially inductive fallacy, right? There are going to be consequences that are unintended because all we have is a high confidence in the probability that we expect that a system is going to behave in this context the way that we intend it to do so. So there's never going to be that 100% guarantee. And as we know, right, I mean, it's, in particular when we talk about it's just going to be more complex. So.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, just, testing for bias, testing, having good validation data that's carefully curated, and gradual fielding, just to make sure that you're not just testing it in sort of simulated environments, but you're also testing it in real-life environments. But I think the DoD is already doing a lot of those things, which is encouraging.
Yeah.
There's a question back there.
There's a question here.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Tom.
Jesse Hamilton, University of Pennsylvania. General Barnes, you talked about the importance of having Jane Snuffy and Joe Snuffy in the foxhole understanding AI. As a former U.S. Army drill sergeant, I'm skeptical of that. Our privates, our soldiers, our sailors don't know a lot about certain capabilities that we have. So an example might be special forces operators on the battlefield. And so I'm wondering if there's something special about AI, militarized AI, that would require rank and file soldiers and sailors to have an understanding of it.
So it's a great question there, Drill Sergeant, former Drill Sergeant. 2 points. One is it's relative to her position. What does she need to know to be effective, to avoid some of the risks in terms of that system? And oh, by the way, the soldiers coming in are probably going to be smarter on some of the, right, especially the COT stuff that we use, right? So in a sense, it's relative to the system. And then the other point, I guess more broadly, is that is our way to ensure, at least across our enterprise, that we have better educated people, not just about artificial intelligence, but I think between you and me, we're really talking about all technology. The work that we're trying to do here about creating ways of thinking, right, just a different mental framework about, say, responsible AI, could really be applied to any sort of new technology, emerging technology. Hypersonics, why aren't we talking about it the same way, right? So in a sense, if we can create the habits of mind, right, relative to the individual's position and help prepare her for her next job, her job after, right? So she's, at the Lance Corporal now, but now, oh, gosh, my gosh, that, boss has been killed. I'm now in that position. What do I, ensure that I need to know it? And again, but we have decision makers at the highest level even who don't understand at least some fundamental things about AI. Do they need to know how to? Of course not. So that was my point of that.
I just want to add, the Navy has started the Naval Community College, which is meant to be for all enlisted, and it's only running sort of a trial program for 5,000 or so people, but the idea is that eventually every enlisted will have the opportunity to get an associate's, and it's primarily focused on computer science, AI, and has a little bit of ethics thrown in. So I think that's a hopeful, I think, movement in that direction.
And a quick analogy, right? So, commander out in a FOB, contractor show up with a UGV, a ground robot. I'm going to test it out, but it's my battle space. What do I know about it? I don't know about robots. I don't know about autonomy. I didn't think about any of this stuff before. You know what would be really cool? Why don't I strap a gun to it? Why not? Well, perhaps, again, relative to their position, it's, that we prepare, in particular, our leaders, NCOs and officers, right, with increased depth of education, right, so they can provide the context to it about why they ought not do that, why they ought to be watching for potentially their soldiers and Marines trying to do something snazzy. Like, hey, instead of just dismantling this bomb, why don't we strap a bomb to it and use it ourselves? Maybe not. I know that, I don't mean to be flippant about it, but I mean, that's partly what's motivating it. You had a question way back? And if I didn't get them all in.
Hi, Felicia Weston, National Intelligence University. My question, one thing I would like to say is thank you for talking about fit for purpose, right? But fit for purpose is also about making sure that we as humans are fit for the purpose of centering or using and teaming with AI. Special Forces has done a lot to understand the mental characteristics needed to have the resiliency and to have the ingenuity to do special operations in the field. What are we doing to identify the characteristics of our human workers to understand who can best team and who can achieve the results that we want achieved?
So one of the things that Lieutenant Colonel Chris Lorentz mentioned yesterday, this concept called soldier-centered design. Well, that should sound a little familiar, right? Because we're talking about human-centered design, in particular from our vantage point and for the roles that our soldiers have to have. And so part of that idea, what motivates it, is the very thing that you're talking about, right? So right from early stages, if you're a design person and you know British double diamond design, at the far left of it, we're engaging in the customer. In our case, it's the soldier, right? In terms of what the mission that she's trying to accomplish, how this tool can best do this, what other limitations, what are both technical changes that need to be made, are there adjustments in the training that she needs to have to be able to employ that? So part of that is ongoing. Is that enough? No, because I think we do have experts in each of our research labs that work on human-machine teaming, but how do we ensure that knowledge that they're developing and they're thinking about there is going to impact the design, development, deployment of these different systems? And that was a challenge, and I think will continue to be a challenge.
Yeah, I could just add that the TEF process, the idea of TEF process being from cradle to grave, and testing this with sort of certified and trained practitioners is a good way to not only learn whether the algorithm is good, whether the AI is good, but also how best to then train and certify people who are going to use it.
Well, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but that was a perfect summary of all the issues that we're going to delve into more in the next session. So, and thank you both for your help building the conference too. I didn't think of all these speakers and the flow of it. I had a lot of help, and you two were extremely helpful throughout. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.